welcome back to my channel. Of course, the heating kicks on right then. If you are not new here, you will notice this is not where I normally film. My husband had a work trip. I'm just along for the ride, so I'm filming from a hotel room. If you are new here, welcome. So today we will go over genre terms, kind of demystify some of the subgenre terms that I see authors throwing around that I honestly don't think most readers know what they are. Some do, some don't. Some people are misusing terms. Either way, it's important to remember that genre, as a rule, it's not the be-all, end-all. It just helps us navigate and find books that we are most interested in. And typically you will see an umbrella term and then a subgenre and then a sub-subgenre, but we'll just call them each layer down is still just called a subgenre. Okay, so we will start with two that I see mixed up an awful lot, and that is high fantasy and epic fantasy. Now, high fantasy is a catch-all, high-level umbrella term. It's kind of the opposite of low fantasy. So high fantasy is in an invented setting, and low fantasy is like real world. So high fantasy, another distinguishing feature, you often see a heavily emphasized magic system. Examples would be like Mistborn, The Lord of the Rings. Epic fantasy has a wide scope with world-changing events and a large cast of characters, typically with multiple points of view in the storytelling. The thing is, there is a lot of overlap between those two. Epic fantasy is defined by the wide scope. High fantasy is defined by the strange setting, basically. But a lot of books are both, like Wheel of Time, Song of Ice and Fire, The Lord of the Rings. So you see those terms mixed up a lot, but they are distinct. There are a few epic fantasies that are not high fantasy, and there are lots of high fantasies that are not epic. Okay, so low fantasy, I did mention, is set in the familiar or mundane world. Typically, there's a theme of the clash between the fantastical and the ordinary, but again, not always. An example of low fantasy would be like the Harry Potter books. And then we have contemporary fantasy, which is a modern setting. Now, that isn't always low fantasy, but it often is. And then we have another one that is often confused, and that's paranormal fantasy versus urban fantasy. So urban fantasy is set in a modern, generally urban setting, although I have seen people using the term for rural settings, and it can be used that way, but typically it's an urban setting. So there are paranormal elements, vampire, ghost, shifters, usually, so that one would be like the Dresden Files. And then paranormal fantasy, which is often used interchangeably but really isn't, can take place in any setting. So that is not time locked, it doesn't have to be modern. And it is more likely to overlap with high fantasy, and it has the same kind of paranormal elements. Interestingly, paranormal romance, which is romance between a human and a paranormal being, like urban fantasy, is usually set in a real world setting, and generally urban. So it's interesting that it's not like urban romance, but yeah. And then we have Grimdark and Noblebright. Now, I don't think I've ever made it to the end of a Grimdark book, just reading them. They are not my cup of tea. Grimdark, that doesn't mean that they're bad books, probably. No, it doesn't mean that they're bad books. It just means that it's not my taste. I know that. So, Grimdark tends to have morally ambiguous characters, bleak settings, nihilistic themes, or they explore like the darker parts of human nature. They typically feature graphic violence and lots of suffering, and they place an emphasis on the grim reality of war and politics. Some of these books have actually had big impacts on, like, they can leave a real lasting impression on people. Again, an example would be like the Sword of Ice and Fire, the series Game of Thrones is based on. Noblebright is kind of like an answer to Grimdark. There's an emphasis on hope, optimism, and the belief that good can triumph over evil. Typically in Noblebright, the characters are flawed, but not to the point where they would be like morally gray. They tend to act honorably. The themes tend to be like kindness, self-sacrifice, and integrity. In Noblebright, there's an emphasis on how individual deeds can have a massive impact. So examples of Noblebright would be like the Lord of the Rings, many of Brandon Sanderson's works, and a lot of classic fantasy in general. I do think Noblebright is making something of a comeback. I've seen it's kind of rising right alongside cozy fantasy, which we'll get to in a minute. But first I wanted to do dark fantasy. So this one is a blending of horror elements with fantasy. Often has morally ambiguous heroes and sort of a gothic aesthetic and gothic roots. I haven't read much dark fantasy myself, so I really can't dive deeper than that. But cozy fantasy has kind of the opposite. Instead of a gothic atmosphere, it's comforting atmosphere. There's low stakes, sometimes with themes of healing from past wounds, whether physical or mental, spiritual. It tends to be character-driven, slice of life, and relational. An example of cozy fantasy would be like Legends and Lattes. But I do see lots of cozy fantasy these days. Especially there seem to be a lot of indie cozy fantasies. Okay, our next one that sometimes gets confused is sword and sorcery versus quest fantasy. I myself confused these two in the past. When I first published Showing Silver, I had it placed under quest, sword and sorcery, which it absolutely is not. My bad. So sword and sorcery focuses on personal stakes rather than a large-scale conflict, often has adventure or quests, and the hero is typically a warrior of some kind facing magical obstacles. But another thing that's like really defining is that the protagonists are often self-serving, and the emphasis is on the action itself. So this is like the action movie of fantasy. A good example would be like Conan the Barbarian. Quest fantasy is similar, but features a virtuous hero, wider stakes. Rather than an obstacle, magic can sometimes be a tool used by the protagonist. I mean, sometimes it's an obstacle, but magic shows up differently. And there's an emphasis on the journey and the moral choices involved rather than the action. Once again, The Lord of the Rings is a good example of quest fantasy. And you'll see how the same book can be an example for multiple genres. Moving on to our next commonly confused pairing, we have romantic fantasy and fantasy romance, which is sometimes called romantasy. Okay. So romantic fantasy is fantasy with a strong romantic subplot. Fantasy romance, or romantasy, is essentially romance with fantasy elements. So to remember them apart, it's kind of, it comes down to the grammar of it. So if you're a grammar nerd like me, the second word is the noun and the first word is the adjective. So the adjective is modifying the noun, but the thing is the noun. So romantic fantasy is fantasy that's romantic. Fantasy romance is romance with fantasy. I'm probably gesturing backwards since my camera does that. But yeah, so that is essentially the difference. Romantasy is the probably more commonly heard than romantic fantasy. Romantasy is probably a term you hear more often than fantasy romance. So you will see romantasy contrasted with romantic fantasy. Romantic fantasy just has a strong romance subplot. Historical fantasy is our next one, and this is kind of an umbrella term. So this is fantasy that blends elements. Essentially, it blends fantasy elements with a real world historical setting or alternative history. So an example of this would be like His Majesty's Dragon, which features dragon riders during the Napoleonic Wars. And there are a lot of like subgenres underneath the historical fantasy umbrella. Gaslamp fantasy is a subset of historical fantasy taking place during Victorian times. Think magical conflicts and folklore. Steampunk is similar, but really more sci-fi. So there's an emphasis on like strange and imagined technologies. Think steam engines and clockwork. Flintlock is historical fantasy with pistols and gunpowder mixed with magical elements. That is most of the genres I have to cover. I will mention another term, which is clean fantasy. I don't think this is really a genre per se, but you do hear it a lot, especially from authors trying to market their work. So clean fantasy typically doesn't have swearing, graphic violence, or sex on the page. I know this is a contested term. Some people find it offensive, but to my knowledge, there is no replacement term currently. You do see no spice used to describe books with no sex, but it's not really a genre designation, and it also doesn't cover swearing and graphic violence. And again, not all clean fantasy is intentionally so. It's more of a descriptor to help readers find it. Although some authors do intentionally write clean fantasy, and there is quite a bit of overlap with like Christian fantasy, but again, they are separate, distinct terms, but you will see them overlap quite a bit. Most books do fit multiple genres, and it's easiest to take it top down. I think I said this earlier. So top down, widest umbrella term first, and then niche down. For an example, like The Lord of the Rings is high fantasy, and it's also epic fantasy, Noblebright, quest fantasy, and possibly even historical fantasy, depending on how you define Middle Earth. It could be an alternative historical Europe, but there's not like a one-to-one of locations, so most people would say it's probably not historical fantasy, but some people argue quite strongly that it is. My own book, Showing Silver, is high fantasy, Noblebright with quest fantasy elements, and it is a clean fantasy. It's also new adult with a coming-of-age storyline, although I did not cover those designations in this video because I really wanted to focus on fantasy. So that is all the terms I researched for today. I did know something about most of them, but I wanted to make sure to be concise and precise. I wanted to make sure I'm accurate and not adding to the confusion. I hope you found this helpful. If there are more subgenres that you don't know what they are or would like clarification, please leave a comment below. I'd love to clarify any that are confusing. If there's a book that you maybe don't know what genre it would be, feel free to share that too. If I've read it, I can comment on it, or if someone else who watches the video has read it, they can kind of add to the conversation. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.